Don't you have anywhere else to go, Mutt? The voice came from across the street, sharp with irritation, but the dog didn't flinch. It just sat there, head low, eyes fixed on the blackened ruins of what had once been a modest home. The charred skeleton of the building groaned under the faint push of wind, its walls warped and bowed, its windows jagged with glass that caught the pale morning light like fractured ice. The dog's fur was a patchwork of ash and soot, its once bright coat dulled to a lifeless gray. Around its neck hung a scorched, half-melted collar that clinked faintly when it shifted. It hadn't moved in hours, maybe days, no one was sure. People walked past on their way to work, some sparing it a glance, others not at all. To them, the fire was yesterday's tragedy. To the dog, it was still burning. From the corner of the block, Mason Hale watched in silence. He'd been a firefighter for 19 years, but this sight unsettled him more than the crackle of flames or the collapse of a burning roof. He'd been there the night it happened, had heard the screams, seen the roof buckle, felt the heat ripple through his gear. He remembered carrying a body out into the street while this same dog had barked and pulled against the leash of a neighbor trying to restrain it. Now, the animal's silence was louder than that chaos had been. A gust swept down the street, scattering a curl of ash from the ruin. The dog's ears twitched, its gaze following the movement as if something invisible had just stepped through the wreckage. Mason took a slow step closer, the gravel crunching under his boots. The air still held the ghost of smoke, faint but stubborn, clinging to the morning like a memory that refused to leave. The neighborhood had changed overnight. Yellow caution tape sagged across the driveway, fluttering against the husk of a mailbox. Burn marks crawled up the siding of the house next door where the paint had blistered and peeled. But the dog didn't look at any of that. It kept its focus locked on a single blackened doorway. The same spot it had been staring at when Mason drove past earlier in the week. "Hey, buddy," Mason murmured, crouching a few feet away. His voice was gentle, but the dog didn't respond, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. There was something in its eyes, an unshakable expectation. A belief that the smoke would part and something, or someone, would walk through that doorway. Mason felt a knot tighten in his chest. He'd seen loyalty before, in men who'd refused to leave a collapsing building until their partner was found. But this was different. This was raw, unreasoning faith. Faith in something that might never come. A passing car slowed, the driver leaning out the window. "That dog's been there since the fire. Won't let anyone take it." Then they drove, off tires spitting gravel. Mason looked back at the animal. Up close, he could see the edges of singed fur, the faint tremor in its legs from holding the same posture too long. He wondered if it had eaten. He wondered what it had lost. A faint, metallic clink broke the stillness as the dog shifted, its gaze never wavering from that empty doorway. Mason followed its line of sight, his mind pulling up images from the night of the fire, shadows flickering inside. The roar of the blaze, the brief silhouette of a woman framed in the window before everything collapsed. The wind picked up again, carrying the faintest scent of something floral, impossible yet undeniable. Mason's eyes narrowed. The dog's tail gave a slow, deliberate thump against the pavement, as though it, too, had caught it. Something told Mason this wasn't just an animal guarding a memory. It was waiting for something. And whatever that something was, it had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with love. But love, Mason knew, could be the heaviest chain of all. He straightened, glancing once more at the blackened doorway. The dog didn't blink. The neighborhood might have already moved on, but here on this sidewalk, time was still holding its breath. And Mason had the sudden, uneasy feeling that when whatever the dog was waiting for finally arrived, the street would never be the same. Mason returned the next morning, coffee in hand, the street still wrapped in that uneasy stillness. The dog, I hadn't moved much, maybe an inch closer to the burned doorway, its body curled against the cracked pavement. Overnight, a thin layer of dew had gathered on its fur, and Mason could see the faint rise and fall of its chest, steady but shallow. The sight pulled at something in him he didn't care to name. Across the street, an elderly woman was sweeping ash from her front steps. She paused when she saw Mason approach and called out, "You're wasting your time. Folks have been trying for days." Her voice carried the weary authority of someone who'd seen more than her share of loss. "That dog won't budge." Mason didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched again, this time setting the coffee on the curb and sliding it toward the animal like an offering. The dog's nose twitched, but its eyes stayed fixed on the doorway. Mason felt the quiet ache of futility. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of people scanning rubble for a hand to hold. Then, from somewhere deep in the ruins, came a sound soft, almost imperceptible, like the shifting of debris under weight. Mason froze. The dog's ears shot forward, every muscle coiled. The air seemed to thicken, the silence pressing in around them. He stepped toward the house, boots crunching over the charred gravel, and peered through the doorway. Inside, light streamed through gaps in the collapsed roof, illuminating clouds of dust that swirled with every breath of wind. There was nothing moving, but the smell hit him, then faint, acrid smoke mixed with something else, something alive. The dog let out a low, tremulous whine, its first sound since he'd seen it. Mason's chest tightened. He took another step closer, scanning the jagged floorboards and blackened beams. The shift in the air, the smell, the sound, none of it felt. Random Mason. The voice came from behind him, and he turned to see a fellow firefighter, Lucas, crossing the street. His friend's eyes tracked from Mason to the dog and then to the ruin. "You're not thinking of going in there, are you? That place is a death trap." "Something's in there," Mason said quietly, his gaze never leaving the dark interior. Lucas frowned. "They cleared it. Twice." "Then they missed something," Mason replied, and in his gut, he knew it wasn't just about what might be inside. The dog's unwavering presence was tethered to it, as if the animal's own heartbeat was linked to whatever lay beyond that doorway. Lucas shook his head but didn't argue. He knew Mason well enough to recognize when his mind was set. "I'll call it in." "You're not going alone." The dog's whine grew sharper, more urgent, as if it sensed that someone was finally listening. It took a step forward, paws on the first scorched board of the porch, tail quivering in anticipation. Mason knelt beside it, close enough now to see the burn marks on its collar, the faint etching of a nameplate warped by heat. Only part of the engraving remained legible. ... He swallowed, the pieces beginning to form a shape he didn't yet want to face. The wind shifted again, and the smell inside grew stronger, pulling Mason's thoughts back to the fire itself. He remembered the chaos, the collapsing beams, the blinding smoke, the woman's silhouette, and how fast everything had happened. The memory burned as vividly as the house had, and for the first time he allowed himself to wonder if the dog had seen the same figure, and was still waiting for her to return. A voice on the radio broke the moment. Backup was on the way. Mason stood, scanning the street as a small crowd began to gather at the edges of the caution tape, drawn by the quiet drama unfolding. The dog, however, didn't care about the people, the noise, or the danger. Its eyes stayed locked on the darkness inside, its body leaning forward like it might spring at any second. And then there it was again. The sound, louder this time, closer to the doorway. Something shifting. Mason's pulse spiked. The dog let out a single sharp bark, its first in days, and the hair on Mason's arms rose. Whatever was inside was coming toward them. And in that moment, Mason knew the next few minutes would change everything, not just for the dog, but for everyone standing on that quiet Ash Street street. Rain began to fall in slow, deliberate drops, hissing softly as they struck the warm, blackened concrete. Mason stood under the shallow awning of a nearby porch, watching the dog through the shifting curtain of water. It hadn't moved. The drizzle darkened its Ash Street fur, and each drop that slid off its muzzle seemed to mark the passing of another unanswered hour. He'd seen determination before, but this was different. This was the kind of quiet persistence that belonged to something deeper than instinct. He'd been checking on the house every other day, drawn by a pull he couldn't explain. The fire, the department had closed the case, insurance investigators had come and gone, and yet Mason kept returning, as though the story here wasn't finished. The dog's eyes told him as much. There was no vacant stare, no sign of hopeless waiting. No, its gaze carried an alertness, a subtle awareness that something was still coming. It reminded Mason of soldiers who kept watch long after the battlefield had gone still. Today, though, the street was different. A moving truck sat idling at the far corner, its hazard lights flashing in the gray drizzle. Two men carried boxes from the house next door, their voices carrying over the hum of the engine. Mason wasn't paying them much attention until he caught one line, faint but sharp through the rain. "Yeah, the old guy, he lived here before. They say his daughter was in that fire." Mason's pulse quickened. He stepped closer to hear more, but the men disappeared back inside. He looked toward the dog, 1,000 questions pressing in. If the house's only resident had been a young woman, then whose name had the dog learned to respond to, and why, days later, was it still staring at that same doorway as though the fire had never touched it? He knelt again, closer this time, ignoring the damp seeping through his jeans. "What are you waiting for, pal?" His voice was almost a whisper, the kind you use with someone deep in thought. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't break its gaze. Mason followed that line of sight once more, and for just a second he could have sworn there was movement. Inside, a flicker, like the shift of a shadow, deeper than the darkness already there. A chill slid down his spine, and he told himself it was just the wind playing tricks with the remnants of the house. Still, something felt off. In all his years on the job, Mason had trusted one thing above all, his gut, and right now, it was telling him this wasn't just a vigil. It was a countdown. The rain thickened, the sound deepening into a steady patter on the cracked pavement. Across the street, the moving truck rumbled into gear, pulling away and leaving the road eerily quiet again. Mason was about to turn back toward his truck when a voice called out from behind him. "You've been watching him too, huh?" Mason turned. An older woman stood a few feet away, her umbrella tilted awkwardly against the wind. She wore a wool coat far too heavy for the mild autumn weather, and her eyes were sharp in a way that made you feel she already knew your answer. "Yeah," Mason replied. "Any idea whose dog this is?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Was hers, the girl who lived there. Name was Lily." The woman's gaze drifted toward the house, and for a moment her voice softened. They found her, but they didn't find everything. Mason frowned. What do you mean? She hesitated, then shook her head as though she'd already said too much. That dog won't leave because it knows something you don't. Something nobody does. Without another word, she turned and started down the sidewalk, her umbrella bobbing in the rain until she vanished around the corner. Mason stayed rooted where he stood, her words digging into his mind. Not everything had been found. He looked back at the dog. It had finally shifted its position, just enough for him to see the scorched leather tag hanging from its collar. The edges were burnt, but a single word was still visible, faded but legible. Stay. The command was both an instruction and a promise, frozen in time. Mason's chest tightened as the pieces began to form a picture he didn't want to see. This animal wasn't just loyal, it had been told to wait. And if the fire had claimed its owner, then what exactly was it waiting for to return through that doorway? The rain eased, leaving the street washed and still. Mason knew he couldn't just leave now. Whatever truth lingered in that house, it was tangled in smoke and silence. And the dog was the only one who seemed to understand it. But as he stood there, studying the blackened threshold, a faint sound drifted from within, a sound that didn't belong to creaking wood or settling ash. It was soft, rhythmic, and achingly familiar. The sound of footsteps. Mason's breath caught, his eyes snapping to the dog. Its tail moved once, a slow, deliberate sweep across the wet pavement. And in that moment, Mason understood two things with chilling certainties. Something was still inside that house, and when it finally stepped out, the story of the fire was going to change forever. The fourth night after the fire brought with it a rain that fell in slow, deliberate sheets, soaking the cracked pavement and drumming against the sagging roof beams of the burned house. The street was almost deserted, its usual hum of evening life replaced by the quiet hiss of water meeting ash. Mason stood under the overhang of a boarded-up shop, watching the dog through the wavering curtain of rain. It was still there, pressed against the front steps of the ruin. Firm, matted and dark, eyes fixed on the doorway as if nothing else in the world existed. The rescue volunteers had tried everything, soft coaxing, food left within reach, even bringing in another dog to spark movement, but each attempt had been met with the same quiet refusal. The animal would accept a few bites, maybe a sip of water, but only if it didn't have to break its vigil. It was guarding something unseen, something Mason was beginning to think might never return. He crossed the street, boots splashing through shallow puddles, and crouched in front of the dog. Up close, its stillness was even more striking. The rain slicked down its muzzle, running in rivulets off the burned edges of its collar. "You can't keep this up forever," Mason murmured, but his own voice felt hollow in the space between them. The dog's ears twitched, but its gaze didn't break. That's when Mason heard it, a sound so faint he thought at first it was the rain playing tricks. A soft, irregular tapping, like something metallic striking wood from somewhere inside the charred remains. He froze, eyes narrowing toward the doorway. The dog's tail gave a single, measured thump. A cold ripple traveled through him. He'd walked through that house after the fire was put out. He knew the floorboards inside were unstable, the ceilings half gone. No one could have survived in there, and yet the sound came again. A pause, then another faint tap, followed by the fragile whisper of movement. Mason rose, stepping carefully over the warped threshold. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet soot, and his flashlight beam cut through clouds of damp ash. Charred furniture slumped in corners like skeletal remains, walls streaked black where the fire had licked them bare. The tapping had stopped, but the dog outside was standing now, its body taut, head tilted toward the back of the house. He moved toward the hallway, each step protesting under his weight. Rain pattered through holes in the roof, landing in shallow puddles that mirrored the jagged shadows above. Then, from the far end, a low sound broke the silence, a whimper. Weak, but alive. Mason's breath caught. He quickened his pace, careful not to send the rotted board splintering beneath him. The whimper came again, followed by a faint scrape, and when he turned the corner, his flashlight fell on a collapsed wardrobe wedged against the back wall. Something shifted behind it. The dog's bark exploded from outside, sharp, urgent, almost pleading. Mason dropped to his knees, angling the beam into the narrow gap between the wardrobe and the wall. Two eyes stared back at him, reflecting the light with a desperate glimmer. It was a cat's skin, soot-streaked, one ear torn. The animal pressed itself against the wall, trembling, its breaths shallow. Mason felt the twist of realization. The dog hadn't been waiting for a person. It had been waiting for this. He wedged his shoulder against the wardrobe, grunting as he pushed. The wood groaned, reluctant to move after days of rain and wait. But with a final shove, it scraped aside enough for the cat to dart forward. Mason caught it before it could retreat deeper into the ruin, wrapping it in his jacket. Its heartbeat was frantic against his chest. When he stepped back outside, the dog was already at the doorway, paws scraping at the wet concrete. It whined, its tail sweeping side to side in a rhythm Mason hadn't seen all week. He knelt and opened his jacket just enough for the two animals to see each other. The cat mooed a small, raw sound and the dog's nose pressed forward. touching it with the gentleness of something that had been waiting far too long. The rain softened around them, the air warm despite the wet. Mason looked from one to the other and felt something deep settle in his chest, a mixture of relief and awe. Whatever had bound these two together had endured fire, smoke, and days of separation. And now, in the ruin's shadow, that bond was the only thing that seemed untouched by the destruction. Still, he knew this was far from the end. The dog was shivering, the cat weaker still. They needed shelter, food, safety. But for this moment, just this moment, he let them have their reunion. Because some rescues aren't about sirens or heroics. Sometimes they're about waiting, and not giving up, no matter how much the world tells you to move on. And as Mason led them away from the burned house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real story of that night had only just begun. The morning after the rescue, the rain had cleared, leaving the air sharp and clean, as if the storm had rinsed away the last clinging ash. Mason sat on the low stone wall outside the animal shelter, watching the dog and cat through the mesh of the outdoor enclosure. The dog, still marked by smoke and exhaustion, lay curled protectively around the smaller shape of the cat, their breathing slow and steady. Every so often the cat's head would lift, eyes half closed, before settling again against the dog's chest. It was the first time Mason had seen either of them rest. The shelter staff had already begun making plans for their care. There were vet checks to arrange, recovery diets to start, vaccinations to update. The practical work was necessary, but Mason knew it wasn't the reason he kept coming back to this spot. It was something quieter, something he couldn't fully name. The night before, in the wreckage of that house, he'd seen what most people spend their whole lives searching for, a bond so absolute that not even fire could sever it. He rose and stepped into the enclosure, the gravel crunching under his boots. The dog's head lifted at once, ears pricking, but there was no wariness in its eyes now. It watched him approach, tail thumping once, then twice against the ground. Mason crouched beside them, running a hand gently along the dog's neck, feeling the wiry stiffness of fur that had been through too much heat and smoke. The cat blinked up at him, still pressed close to its companion, as though it had no intention of letting go. "You kept your promise," Mason murmured, his voice almost lost in the breeze. He wasn't sure if he meant it for the dog, the cat, or himself, perhaps all three. A few shelter volunteers were watching from the doorway, and one of them, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, spoke softly. "We tried to separate them earlier so the vet could examine the cat. The dog nearly broke through the kennel door to get to it." Mason smiled faintly. "Then don't separate them again. Not unless you have to." There was no argument. It was clear to everyone here that whatever had happened before the fire, whatever life they'd shared in that house, they would face the future together. The dog's vigil hadn't been about grief, it had been about hope, an unshakable belief that the one it loved was still out there. And it had been right that the sun edged higher, warming the gravel and catching on the shelter's windows. In that light, the dog's coat no longer looked entirely gray. Hints of its original color emerged where the soot had been brushed away. The cat's eyes, once clouded with exhaustion, now tracked the movement of sparrows darting above the fence. Recovery would be slow, but it had begun. Mason stood to leave, though his feet resisted. He'd told himself this was just another call, just another case of helping where help was needed. But as he watched them, to survivors bound by something beyond explanation, he felt a quiet shift. It was a reminder that not all rescues are measured in minutes and sirens. Some happen in the silent days afterward, in the waiting, in the refusal to give up. He reached down one last time, letting the dog's head rest briefly against his hand. The cat mewed softly, a sound that was less plea now and more acknowledgement. Mason took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest before he turned toward the gate. As he walked away, he didn't glance back immediately. But just before reaching his truck, he stopped over his shoulder. He saw them both watching him, the dog sitting tall despite its weariness, the cat tucked safely at its side. Their eyes followed him, not with need, but with the steady calm of those who had endured the worst and come through still together. The burned house would eventually be torn down. The lot cleared. The street returned to its rhythm. People would forget the night of the fire, the smoke curling against the sky. But Mason knew there was one thing the flames hadn't touched. Some bonds outlast the ruin. They survive the silence, the storms, and the long aching wait. He started the engine, the hum low in the still morning, and drove off with that image fixed in his mind, the two of them in the golden light, side by side, guarding something invisible yet unbreakable. It was a reminder that survival isn't just about making it out alive. Sometimes, it's about holding on until the one you love can make it out with you.